world tonight. Don't forget, tell a friend. We are growing slowly but surely, and we're growing virally because you guys are telling folks. So please keep telling people that, hey, did you know there's a show 5 nights a week that you can hang out and it's okay to be a Christian there. And they talk about all kinds of cool stuff. And if there's cool stuff that you'd like us to be talking about, if there's an author, a speaker, something that you've come across that you think, man, people would like to learn more about that, please email me with the information and we'll definitely pursue it, okay? So VDJ at crossing-the-world.com or crossingtheworldforchrist at gmail.com. Either way, it'll get to me, and I'd be thrilled to hear what you have to say. All right, let's bring Doug back in here because I want to hear what Doug has to say.
Hey there.
Douglas Woodward, and his book is available at Survival Mall. It is Decoding Doomsday. It's a Christian perspective on 2012. Now, Doug, I'll ask the same question that I asked you before the break, this time open-ended. Can you draw a straight line from the mysticism of Hitler and the Nazis to what's going on in the New Age movement today?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways in which we could do that. Certainly, just the concept of higher consciousness, the thought that the belief that there are these powerful entities that we would consider to be demons, but spirit beings that Hitler and those that were into the occult in the 1920s and so forth were seeking to reach out to and influence for the sake of the world, the plan for world domination and the purifying of the Aryan race and so forth. So you have all of that. One of the more interesting connections, we talked a bit, I think, last time about a current day author, a guy named Daniel Pinchback. Great author, written a really, really interesting book, which is basically the Quetzalcoatl, the rise of, or the return of Quetzalcoatl in 2012. And Pinchback's book covers a lot of his own experiences with mescaline, with various types of drugs and drug derivatives, basically what's known as the spirit molecule, dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which is in peyote, which is in a number of magical mushrooms and so forth. Anyway, Pinchback talks a lot about his experiences using these different drugs from around the world and the kinds of trips that they gave him. But he encounters various spirit beings as a result of this. Ultimately, he tells the story that he encounters Quetzalcoatl himself. For those not familiar, Quetzalcoatl, also known as Kukulkan, is supposedly the spirit god who is to return in 2012 at the conclusion of the Mayan calendar. He's known as the feathered serpent. The Cherokees call him the feathered rattlesnake. He is to be basically a savior of sorts, who is to come back and is to set us all right in terms of our awareness of consciousness and what the world should be and how we should be and so forth. But there's a particular individual, a guy named Rudolf Steiner, that is a direct connection between Pinchback and Hitler. And it's just because Pinchback refers to him quite a few times. Steiner actually lived in the late 1800s and then, or rather 1900s and then, 1800s and then died, I think, in 1925. But Steiner was, in fact, I was going to quote something from Hermann Rausching, who's probably written the only definitive, true history, and he was basically one of Hitler's henchmen. But he wrote a book called Hitler Speaks, and in it he basically makes this statement about a guy named Rudolf Steiner, sort of a white magician. He says it was because Adolf Hitler was unable to hide any of his activities from Rudolf Steiner's spiritual vision that he declared him to be the greatest enemy of the Nazi Party. And the first unsuccessful attempts were made to murder Steiner on Munich railway station in 1922. Steiner is the founder of a sort of a variant of theosophy, if I can pronounce it correctly, Anthroposophical Society. So instead of theosophy, which is basically God wisdom, it's sort of man wisdom.
Sure.
So he sort of flipped that idea on its head. But anyway, Steiner was a brilliant individual who supposedly developed the ability to be conscious empirically with the five senses at the same time that he was conscious of what Madame Blavatsky and the occultists call the Akashic record, which is sort of a Hindu philosophy. I describe it as sort of a belief that surrounding us is this ether, and it's like a kind of like an unlimited DVR. Everything that happens is recorded in the molecules of the ether. Supposedly, Steiner could actually read this ether because he was such a high-level initiate, and he could actually go back in time or go forward in time. He could see things, and he could actually describe them as he was witnessing these things. Well, supposedly Hitler was so worried about Steiner that they sought to kill him, and they drove him out of Germany, and eventually he died a demoralized man because of this. But Steiner's work lives on through his society, but it's interesting is that Pinchbeck quotes him extensively as somewhat of a sort of the perhaps the right insight, the person with the right insights to interpret so many of the experiences that people are having today as they probe into higher consciousness, as they use drugs to attempt to encounter these spirit beings. And so he's a direct connection between what was going on. That's not to say that Pinchbeck is a Nazi, because he's by no means that, nor was Steiner. It's just that there is a connection between the type of reality that they believed in and that they were dealing with, and the reality that the other reality, the alternative reality that people very far into the 2012 movement are also connected with.
Now, when you contrast in your book, sort of Hitler and this man of war with the coming Antichrist, a man of peace, and you look at all of these New Age religions, and they're all peaceful. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, of course, there's a couple of different issues there. Let's talk really primarily about the Antichrist. You're referring to a section of the book where I talk about Friedrich Nietzsche and talk about his concept from his book of the Antichrist and also from his book Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But Nietzsche talks about the Übermensch, the Superman, very much a concept of Hitler in terms of the Aryan race, the Superman. Hitler's Supermen were to be featured in the 1936 Olympics, you might recall, and they were whipped thoroughly by Jesse Owens from the colored race, as Hitler would have said, that proved that his Supermen were still half-baked. But nevertheless, Nietzsche called for the overcoming of mankind, talked about the thought that God is dead and that man therefore needs to become the measure of all things. And so Nietzsche sort of gave some philosophical background to the concept of the Übermensch, the Übermann. And today we use the term Uber a lot. Well, that's where it comes from, is from that discussion about the sort of the Superman. And so anyway, the question then, as we look at today's sort of theories about Antichrist, Hitler was very definitely a form of Antichrist. There's no question about that. But he was, Nietzsche would have said that he was preoccupied with sort of the Dionysian or the Bacchian, Bacchus, that god, that he was sort of overwhelmed, influenced by him as opposed to the other god, the god Apollo. And so there's sort of the two aspects of human personality that Nietzsche discusses, which roughly correlates to Freud's concept of superego, ego, and id. But essentially the Apollonian or the Apollo style is more of the superego, more of the tightly controlled. We might think of it as a fascist, but a non-spiritual sort of fascism, in which it's supremely right-wing, and that the promise of peace comes, but at the expense of personal liberty. And so what I conjecture is that the Antichrist that will soon appear, I believe, will be of the spirit of Apollo. It's interesting that I believe it's in chapter 7 or chapter 9, I think it's chapter 9:11 of Revelation, where the king of the bottomless pit, in which the pit is opened, is called Abaddon or Apollyon. And Abaddon is the Hebrew word for Apollo, and Apollyon is a derivative Greek word for Apollo. And so the conjecture that I share in my book is that the Antichrist is actually of the spirit of Apollo. And of course, that opens up this whole connection of how the spirit of Apollo has actually been connected with many antichrists throughout history.
Yep.
Whether it was, and so forth. So let me stop right there and see if you want to go a different direction. But I
No,
can
you're
talk more about that if you like.
no, you're going great. And the whole idea now of the destroyer and Apollo, and just keep. You went.
Keep going.
You went down
Okay.
exactly the road I was hoping you were. So just keep on flying here.
There's a very mysterious connection here. Tom Horn. I got to give Tom Horn great credit for this because Tom really, I think, broke the code on this and pointed this out by doing some study in classical mythology and so forth. But the connections between Apollo and ancient gods, the Egyptian god Osiris.
Yes.
The Egyptian god Osiris is equivalent to the Greek and the Roman god Apollo. Apollo was the name of that god both in Greek and Roman mythology. And we think Osiris is connected to Orion. And Osiris was really viewed as in the Orion constellation. We think of the belt of Orion and so forth. May have talked a bit about this last time, but the theory of Robert Bauval, which I think is pretty compelling, is that the pyramids of Giza are arranged in alignment with the belt of Orion.
Yes.
And it's sort of a symbol of the fact that this god was the primary god that they were focused on. He's often considered the sun god, talked about as the sun god. It's interesting that the swastika is actually a symbol of the sun, by the way. It's interesting that Orion the Hunter, if you go back to look at some great scholar like E.W. Bullinger in his study of the stars, the constellations, he will tell you that Orion is actually the hunter. And there's a very direct connection between the hunter and Nimrod of the Old Testament. Even someone like Chuck Missler today would say that really the Antichrist is to be a reincarnation of Nimrod. Which is talked about, of course, in Isaiah and Jeremiah and some of the other minor prophets. But what you see throughout history is this connection of Apollo, Orion, Nimrod, up to today's world. And even other connections. We could talk about Antiochus Epiphanes the Fourth, who was the Greco-Syrian king that desecrated the temple in 170 BC, that started the Maccabean revolt,
right,
and leading eventually, of course, to the Jewish liberation and the holiday Hanukkah. And so forth. But I show in my book showing on one side a coin minted by Antiochus Epiphanes. On the other side of the coin, interestingly, is Apollo playing his harp. If we fast forward to the time of John the Revelator writing his book, it's very likely that when he was thinking of the Antichrist, he was thinking of Domitian, who was a great enemy of the early church, who wanted to be seen as Apollo. And so his view of himself was that he was a reincarnation of Apollo. We fast forward to 19th century France, and we have a guy named Napoleon. Napoleon, if you look at the word carefully, you realize it's really refers to the new Apollo, Napoleon. And so once again, you have another connection to Apollo. And then, as I mentioned with Hitler, the swastika, the sun, the connection with the sun god, and so forth. So the theory is that the spirit that comes back to life, if you will, that incarnates the Antichrist, is the spirit of Apollo, the destroyer. And so anyway, I give Tom Horn a lot of credit for sort of breaking the code, and then I've sort of added a little additional color to that. But anyway, that's kind of the essence of what I talk about there in terms of the Antichrist, and then we get in from that, kind of branch into the subject of transhumanism and what it might mean for the Antichrist. What might the Antichrist be like, and how might he be connected even with the concept of the Nephilim, the giants that were discussed even by Hitler, the Supermen, and so forth. And the question of whether Antichrist might even be possibly a demigod himself. Of course, we'd see his spirit perhaps being connected to Apollo. But what if his body in some way had been affected, was no longer purely human, but was in fact somehow spliced with DNA from a non-human source? There's a tremendous amount of conjecture and discussion going on today amongst a number of prophecy authors, evangelical authors, discussing this possibility and really straining at the origins discussed in Genesis chapter 6, and thereafter talking about the Nephilim, and is it possible that there is a connection between the Nephilim and the Antichrist? And so I discussed that matter pretty thoroughly in chapter 12 of the book.
S. Douglas Woodward is the name that you look for on the book Decoding Doomsday. If you go to survivormall.com, you can find it there. If you go to my Facebook page, you'll find the link there. We heartily recommend the book to you. It is a Christian response to all of the paranoia going on around 2012. And if people want to talk about great prophets, I'm not interested in Nostradamus. I'm not interested in Edward Casey. I'm a lot more interested in the Apostle John. I'm a lot more interested in Elisha and Elijah and Daniel and Ezekiel. Those are great prophets. Those are men of God. That's where we need to be looking for our past, present, and future. We need not get caught up in the New Age thinking that's going on. You may remember a week ago when I talked about the taint and how the world taints our thinking, and there's no way around it unless you totally disconnect from everything. That taint sneaks in one way or another, and we've got to be aware that we're all tainted and that we've got to fight back against that, and the best way I know is bury yourself in a book like Doug's, and even more importantly, bury yourself in the Lord and the Bible. So, that being said, we're going to keep wandering down this road just a little bit longer with Doug before we have to let him go in about 10 minutes. Okay, the Nephilim. I remember the first time I was ever exposed to this was back in the mid-'80s when I was in Bible college, and I did a major paper on Genesis 6, and I started to really pray about this whole sons of God, daughters of men, what the heck is going on here? And I started to read work by Morris, I believe it was, and others, and I started to go, whoa. And I presented this to the dean of the Bible college, and he said, well, Vince, it's something that's being talked about more and more. I don't know how mainstream it is today. That was 20-some-odd years ago. The truth of it is today, it seems as though the whole idea of the Nephilim is starting to become a lot more mainstream. There are more and more Christians looking at this now going, yeah, there's definitely something there. And then the thing that really blew my mind is the book of Enoch, which is referred to in the Bible and referred to in a positive sense in that people in the Bible referred to the book of Enoch using it as a source. And at least the first book of Enoch, I think when men got together and made the decision as to which books would be in the Bible and which books wouldn't, we have to trust that God's hand was on them. But I think there is a book or two that maybe could have been in there, and I don't know that the Lord would have been upset. And maybe there is a reason in God's plan that the book of Enoch didn't end up in the Bible we know today, and maybe it's tied into the whole idea of Daniel and seal this up, and until the end times, people really aren't going to understand it. And maybe the Lord needed us to be relatively in the dark until now. But Doug, it does seem that this whole idea of Nephilim, this whole idea of somehow demons interbreeding with human beings, the heroes of old, the giants of old, there's something resonating in more and more people that they're going, yeah, this is truth. And then when you read the word,
that's right.
I'll shut up here in a second and give you the last 10 minutes, I promise. But when you read the word, and then you look that they're making a comeback. If we read this, it looks as though they may be making a comeback in the end times as well. All right, I've set you up. You can take it whatever way you want. I'll shut up. The last 10 minutes are yours.
I appreciate that. Well, no problem. What I discovered as I began to study this myself over the last couple of years is that the whole issue of giants in the Bible, I would have thought, well, boy, this is really a peripheral issue. I mean, don't get hung up on this because this is just so obscure. And then I started looking to all the references in the Old Testament to the Nephilim and the Rephaim, and some things dawned on me. I was stunned. I didn't realize that it's pretty clear in the translation of the King James Version that the reason that Noah was selected and he and his family is because it says in the King James, he was perfect in all of his generations. He had not been tainted by what we could consider angelic DNA. So that's certainly one of the thoughts, is that the reason that God utterly destroyed humankind and all land animals is that angels had been messing with human and animal DNA. The concept of the chimera, the mixture of beasts, different types of beast, or man and beast. There's some reason to suspect that these weren't just hallucinations that early man had with taking too many magical mushrooms, but that in fact there was that kind of manipulation. Certainly the book of Enoch talks about that.
Yep.
By the way, I agree with you. Enoch was you might say, a near miss in terms of being included in the Bible. And I think it's fascinating just to have a discussion on why it might not have been. But you see it cited not only within the New Testament itself, it's cited in certainly in the book of Jude, I believe also in the book of 2 Peter.
Right.
But it's cited by many of the church fathers, Irenaeus and Hippolytus, Tertullian, and so forth. So it was a highly regarded, respected source book that the early church relied upon. So it was very close to being considered in the Bible itself. Yet it was not. And so, but it tells a fantastic story, and I don't know if we have a whole lot of time to get into it, but we'll touch on it. Perhaps we'll talk more about this when we get together again. But certainly, I would say one other quick comment is that many of the scholars that folks respect, Chuck Missler, I can't say for Grant Jeffrey, certainly J.R. Church, Gary Stearman, to the extent they respect me. There's a number of scholars that are saying it's very clear that the Nephilim were not just the righteous sons of Seth, which was one of the old theories,
right,
but they were in fact offspring of a mixture of demonic or angelic and human DNA. Now, how that could possibly happen, I mean, it asks all that kind of infers all kinds of fantastic questions that I can't imagine. But the Scripture is clear that it teaches that. And as I started to say, if we look at Numbers 13:33, I believe it is, and some other places, it's fascinating that the reason that the Hebrews failed to take over the land after they had gone through the Exodus. They had basically they had not gone through the wilderness yet. They had gone through the Exodus. They had parked basically probably in near the Moabite land, and were ready to go forth and take the land. And they sent in 12 spies, which I'm sure you remember, Vince, of Caleb and Joshua and the other 10 spies. And they came back. The spies all came back after they'd spied out the land, and they said, "Gee,
giants in the land.
The land is full of giants. It's full of Nephilim, the whole land of Canaan." And
my understanding is that
heights,
my understanding is giants is actually Nephilim, correct? When you look at the translation, it isn't giant; it's Nephilim.
It can mean the mighty men. Gibborim is another word that relates to this, but in fact, that's even tied into Nimrod. We may not have time there to talk about the fact that Nimrod, number one, the first Nimrod, became a Gibborim. Tom Horn speculates that somehow Nimrod's DNA was also tweaked by the angels, because we find out that the fall of these angels to earth, that the infection of humanity occurred not only before the flood, but it occurred after the flood. That's what it says in Genesis 6:4. And so anyway, to finish the story, the reason that the Jews did, the Hebrews did not go after and take over the land was because they saw these giants, and they basically said, "Gee, they saw us and we were like grasshoppers in their eyes, and gee, we were like grasshoppers in our own eyes. And yet Joshua and Caleb, of course, they said, so what, big deal, God's on our side, we can defeat these giants. But nevertheless, the people murmured, and basically they decided not to take the land because of the giants. And so they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And so you look at the stories, David and Goliath. Obviously, Goliath too was a Nephilim. This whole concept of giants and so forth, it ends up not being a peripheral issue, but in fact, it's a key element of the whole story of salvation and the plan for salvation. So that's why it is beginning to occupy a number of folks in terms of studying this. And as I said, the reference to Nimrod and how he became a mighty one, who was really the originator of the Tower of Babel, for those that may not, for listening that may not remember. It's a hint that the Antichrist, who will be the second Nimrod, will be somehow infected as well with some type of strange DNA. And of course, this gets into the whole discussion about extraterrestrials and extraterrestrial life and crop circles and what all of this means. And yours truly is crazy enough to have tried to talk to all these things in my book. So I guess that's a good segue back to the book. But there's so many fascinating things going on right now, and an explosion of knowledge, and the unsealing of Daniel is definitely happening in our time. So from the standpoint of learning and understanding what's really been going on in the world for the last 6,000 years, it's an exciting time to be alive and to be able to read and to study these things.
Well, I really believe what you just said, and I'm starting to really absorb it, embrace it, become part of it more and more every day. The idea of the book of Daniel being revealed, and we as Christians having really a new revelation, a new understanding. And you read that, and as a young Christian, you go, well, man, I don't want to get caught up in some sort of weird belief. I don't want to get pulled into a cult. I don't want to, and as well you should. I mean, we need to be careful to guard our minds. But what's happening, I believe, is that there is this new revelation coming, and I believe it's coming just in time for the Lord to warn his people that we will not be ignorant of Satan's devices in these end times. And, I don't know Tom nearly as well as you do. I've been fortunate enough to have him on the program 3-4 times. And the whole idea of the chimera of blending animal and human DNA, which we're already doing, and beyond that, where is this all going?
Correct.
And what are we going to end up with spiritually? What do you get? And it just starts to really, at first, boggle your mind in the sense of, oh man, I can't deal with this. But then you go back to it and go, well, wait a second. This is really happening. This is hard science. They are merging animal and human DNA. We know that's a fact. We know science always gets into things they shouldn't. We know they're going to take this further than they should. If anybody's read The Island of Dr. Moreau, we got an idea of where this is headed. But what are the spiritual implications of it? Then beyond that, the whole idea of Nephilim, the fact that Joshua and Caleb, you can make a case, didn't kill them all. And when God said wipe out all of Ai and wipe out the rest of these, they didn't exactly fulfill the mission. Could that mean there are still some still alive today? I don't know. But there's a lot of new questions as Christians that we start to ask. And I think that's exciting because bottom line, it's going to drive us back to the Bible. It's going to drive us to our knees. It's going to drive us to pray, Lord, give us wisdom, insight, and if it be your will, reveal and open the book of Daniel to me so that I might have understanding. And that's exciting.
Absolutely. I might just mention to the audience that in July, Tom Horn is hosting a conference in Branson, Missouri, and it's called World Congress so and so. But it's essentially on this topic of transhumanism, which is sort of the scientific effort to improve the human genome by adding to or changing, altering our DNA, which is just a scary thought to begin with. But anyway, you can read about that on his site, Raiders News Network as well. And again, I write articles that are out there talking on some of these things and going into more depth. But it's a fascinating subject. One thing that I might just leave with is a little bit of a tease for another time.
Sure.
Another topic is Tom actually goes into the discussion of, is it possible that the mark of the beast itself will be some form of genetic splice that humans have to accept in order to be perhaps preserved against some form of virus, such as is discussed in the movie Legend that we saw with Will Smith. And apologize for the phone ringing.
No, don't worry about it.
But anyway, there's it's a fascinating and scary thought that the mark of the beast may not be a number. It may be, in fact, some type of a genetic splice that human beings have to accept. And it's even possible that accepting that splice automatically makes you a non-human, and perhaps that is why those in the tribulation that accept the mark of the beast cannot be saved.
It's interesting. I'm presuming you've probably done a lot of research on the 12ers, the 12th Imam, and what Muslims believe. And part of what they believe with the 12th Imam is that he will give them, they describe him as the beast, and that they will receive the mark of the beast, and that it's a good thing. And I don't know if you've done the research or seen that.
Fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah. And all of a sudden you look at this and go, hokey smokes. I mean, this all...
Hokey smokes.
Either somebody
That's right.
really twisted in a cave somewhere 3,000 or 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, started just, writing real weird, or... man, it's a mighty God we serve, and that's a good thing. You have done a brilliant job of...
spiritual force behind it, right?
Amen. Beautiful tease. We will reconvene. I'll fire you an email in a couple of weeks when it's convenient for you. Right. Man, you got everybody freaking out going, oh, no, what? So that's good. That's good. They'll have to come back for more.
That's where we want everybody.
There we go. Or, even better, buy the book.
Buy the book. I talk about these things in that book.
There you go.
And even it's pretty good research. You'll see the fact that I don't just make it up.
You are a truly brilliant man, and it is just a joy and an honor to have you on the show. Doug, thank you so much.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I enjoyed Vince a lot, and I look forward to it again. And thank you for all the accolades and the support, and God bless you.
All right, brother. Talk to you soon. Good